Good morning, everyone. I'm a professor of epidemiology and public health. So my presentation will deal with the debate on low-calorie sweeteners from the standpoint of public health. I want to leave you with two thoughts. Sometimes the debate is animated by facts and information and figures, and sometimes it's just a debate with no facts and no figures and no nothing. So that's the first thought. Today is going to be different. Today we have a whole day full of information, facts, and how they relate to policy. The second thought I want to leave you with is this. In public health, we typically think of health as the end point. We look at behaviors that lead to good health, behaviors that lead to bad health, diets that lead to disease or not. In every case, health is the end point, is the end. Actually, to my mind, health is only the beginning. Health can actually be used as a predictor of various behaviors, sometimes unexpected, sometimes controversial, sometimes behaviors we cannot really account for. But make no mistake, health was the reason. And I'll talk about that today. So let's go and take a look at the positions of government agencies and non-governmental health organizations about low-calorie sweeteners. This is the one I like best. It goes back to 2012. This is the Journal of the American Academy for Nutrition and Dietetics, and the position of the Academy was that consumers can safely enjoy a range of caloric and non-caloric sweeteners, provided they follow an eating plan proposed by the government, but also they follow individual health goals and, importantly, personal preferences. Why mess with a winning formula? The updates have not been as good. The Dietary Guidelines 2015 did say that evidence from short-term randomized controlled trials, that's RCTs, supported the notion that replacing sugars with low-calorie sweeteners reduced calorie intake, body weight, and fatness in the short term. But they waffled a bit about long-term observational studies. They said they were inconsistent. That's not exactly true. There are just fewer long-term studies. They are very difficult to run, and few people run them well, and you will hear an example of those studies today. And then diabetes risk in adults, that is a case of reverse causality. I will talk to you about that as well. So Dietary Guidelines 2015-2020 waffled a bit on this topic, and then we have the most recent science advisor from the American Heart Association, which said a number of interesting things. First of all, they allowed that the use of low-calorie beverages was an effective strategy for weight control and could promote weight loss. For habitual users of sugar beverages, low-calorie sweeteners were an option. But then they went on to say that the American Heart Association does not recommend consumption of low-calorie beverages for children. As you will see later on, children do not actually consume low-calorie beverages. And then here the AHA echoed the World Health Organization, recommending limiting added sugars to 5% for women and 7.5% for men. Why 7.5%? Why 5%? We have no idea. I have no idea where this came from. Mystery. Then they figured out that water was the optimal beverage of choice. We'll deal with that. And then the AHA paper published in Circulation recycled a number of arguments which I thought we had done away with decades ago, and some of them seem to be contradictory anyway, but they were cited nonetheless. So here you have the claim that low-calorie sweeteners foster a taste preference of sweet foods. Simultaneously, they make naturally sweet foods less appealing. They substitute for healthier beverages. At the same time, they could be a gateway beverage for sugar beverage consumption. And then the old arguments about hunger, fullness, satiety, gut microbiota were already brought up again. Today's presentations, following mine, will deal with each and every one of those issues in turn, so you will know exactly what the truth is, what the science is, and how the truth and the science inform policy or not. Sometimes science and policy take divergent paths in policies based on emotion and not on science. So my questions here are, where exactly does evidence meet policy? So what are the consumption trends and use patterns for low-calorie beverages? And here I was at a meeting in Los Angeles the other day, and a very eminent scientist, one of our most distinguished ones, actually made a serious claim that sweetened beverages were the largest source of calories in the American diet. Are sugar-sweetened beverages the largest source of calories? The answer here is overwhelming no. When you see here on this slide is clear evidence that most dietary energy comes from foods and not from beverages. Foods are in purple, beverages are in multi-colors. You see milk and soda and fruit juice and fruit drinks and sports drinks and coffee and tea, and they are not the major source of calories in the American diet. For adolescents, actually, the major source of calories seems to be pizza. And you see here this beautiful age-dependent curve, because people eat more as they grow, and then after a certain age, you actually eat less and less and less as you get older, because these are not the calories that you need anymore. Nature takes care of that. So when you start looking at the percent of calories from various sources, you can see that the percent of calories from beverages is between 10 and 20% of energy depending on age. Notice that for older adults, around 50 plus, it is about 10% altogether. Children, adolescents consume more, but notice also that children and adolescents consume mostly milk. Sugar-sweetened beverages are here in red, and yes, there is an age-dependent increase followed by a decrease. Older people consume much less sweetened beverages. Notice, of course, that the obesity rates and the rates of diabetes increase with age as the consumption of sugar actually goes down. The time trends are exactly the opposite for obesity and diabetes and for the consumption of sugar. Most sugar is consumed by young, active people who are not obese. And again, remember that sugar-sweetened beverages can be replaced with low-calorie sweeteners to give you 0 calories, but the window of opportunity is not infinite. You can replace the beverages shown here in red and green and darker green. Most of the milk is it's got natural lactose. There is no added sugar. You can replace added sugars with low-calorie sweeteners. So second question, are sugar-sweetened beverages the largest source of added sugars? And here the answer is yes, they are, for the 14 to 50 age group. Notice here, as we go down again along the ages, that the grains and other foods, any dairy, any solid foods account for quite a bit of the added sugars. Again, the beverages are shown in red, the sodas, green, fruit drinks, and then tea and flavored milks and coffee and so on. So yes, for the 14 to 50 age groups, beverages do provide a large proportion of added sugar. That in fact is correct. The American Heart Association promoted water as the beverage of choice. Is water already the beverage of choice? Yes, it is. Looking here at data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey in the US, you can see that water accounts for most of the liquids water consumed. So when you stop looking at calories and start looking at water, milliliters of water, a lot of the water is coming from water, both tap and bottled, milk for children, and then the other beverages. Again, on the right-hand panel, water and milk account for between 50 and 60% of all the water consumed. So I would say, American Heart Association, don't worry, water still is the beverage of choice in the United States. Is the consumption of sweetened beverages and low-calorie beverages declining in the US? That was a major point made by the circulation paper. Here I plotted the data as shown in the paper. There were two complicated tables, and as you see here, that is correct. The consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages is in fact down sharply. What you see here in gray and blue is the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages at various ages. And looking at time trends, you see that the consumption is down, especially among younger people, 2 to 19. Those curves are going down, and the age differential is dropping. When you start looking at the low-calorie beverages in beige and red, you see a slight decline from a peak in 2005, but nothing like the drop in sugar-sweetened beverages. In fact, the American diet contains much less added sugar than it did 10 years ago, not just the beverages, but also sweetened cereals and other sources of added sugar. The public seems to be eating less sugar from all sources, not, as I say, not just beverages, but other sources as well. So this is what we see in our analyses of NHANES, and in fact, these are more recent data, ending in 2013 and 14, published by AHA, and those data are in fact correct. This is what's happening. We've seen it elsewhere as well. The decline in sweetened beverages was actually greatest for the 12 to 39-year-old age group. Note the gray and the green bars, which are the 12 to 19 and 20 to 39. Those are going down much more sharply than the other groups. So again, the decline in consumption, the changes in consumption are very often age and sometimes gender specific, and there's a secular decline as a function of time. There is a drop. Now, we do not see that nearly as much with low-calorie beverages. Yes, as I said, there is a bit of a decline since 2005 in the critical 40 to 59 age group, but the other groups, younger and older, it is pretty steady, and what's important, the consumption is fairly low. So when you start looking at consumption of low-calorie sweeteners by children, and again, these are data from the AHA paper, you see that the consumption is extremely low. When you start looking at servings per day and recalculate what does it mean really, that means 1 8-ounce serving every 50 days for very young children, and 1 8-ounce serving every 10 days for the 12 to 19-year-olds. So when the American Heart Association says low-calorie sweeteners are not recommended, they are worrying about something which is not happening anyway. I would say that 1 ounce serving every 50 days, to my mind, is not a big public health issue. You've got to figure out what the public health issues are and are not, and focus your attention on the serious issues. And this is a bit of a false alarm, if you ask me. Now, I've been showing you data for the United States for various ages from the federally sponsored studies, the National Health and Nutrition Surveys, but there are other data from other countries, notably France and the UK. And here we published some papers on the consumption of beverages by children, looking at the time of day and the type of meal. There are some interesting things here which distinguish French beverage drinking patterns, British beverage drinking patterns from those observed in the US. So this is a slide from a paper published in 2017. This was analysis of INCA2 data for children ages 4 to 13. The French Inca data are based on 7-day diaries. The American data are usually based on 2 days or just one single day. And notice here that French children drink milk for breakfast in yellow, and they also drink 100% juice for breakfast, shown here in green. And then during lunch and dinner, French children drink water, both tap and bottled. Here we distinguish between tap water and bottled water. Very nice distinction here between the two. It's about 50-50 in France. In other places it is not, but in France 50-50 tap and bottled. And note that consumption of fruit-based drinks and sodas is fairly low. Low-calorie beverages do not even figure in the diet of French children. We couldn't find them to show on the slide over here. Now, the French situation is not the same as the British situation. In Britain, the consumption of water is much lower. Here we're not able to distinguish between tap and bottled. Consumption of milk is highest at breakfast, between 6 and 9 a.m. But interestingly, British children were drinking fruit drinks, sweetened fruit drinks, pretty much at every time of day. The consumption of carbonated sodas was, by contrast, fairly low. So there are a number of interesting findings here, looking at the time of day, the place, and then the balance between water consumption, caloric drink consumption, juice consumption, and consumption of low-calorie beverages. Again, here, there was not much of low-calorie beverage consumed in this age group. These are data from NDNS, the British National Nutrition Survey, based on 4 days of intake. Excuse me, come back. So now we come to ask who actually does consume low-calorie sweeteners in the US? Who are those people? What can we say about them? What are their characteristics? So what are the demographics of low-calorie beverage consumption in the US? There's also other sweeteners used as tabletop and also in foods, but beverages provide most of low-calorie sweeteners consumption in the US. So first of all, there's a big effect of age. Consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages drops. Consumption of low-calorie sweeteners increases with age for both men and for women, as you see on the right-hand panels on this slide. The effects are fairly dramatic. And then, as I will show you, consumption of low-calorie beverages goes up with socioeconomic status, education, and income. It is actually related to better diets. And then, even though more overweight people consume low-calorie sweeteners, they do it for a specific purpose of weight loss. And Haines data and other data have never really looked at motivation. We managed to do that by combining two data sets, the social sciences component of NHANES with the dietary intake component of NHANES, and we were able to identify who had been trying to lose weight over the previous year. So, first of all, more consumption of low-calorie sweeteners with higher education. These data are age-adjusted and also adjusted for BMI and for diabetes. Notice that consumption of low-calorie sweeteners go up as you go from less than high school education to college education and above. And at the same time, obesity rates go in the opposite direction, because obesity does follow a socioeconomic gradient, which is the reverse socioeconomic gradient. There is less obesity at higher education levels. We find the same thing with race ethnicity in the US. People consuming most low-calorie sweeteners, or are most likely to be consuming low-calorie sweeteners, are non-Hispanic whites, followed by Mexican Americans, followed by non-Hispanic blacks. And of course, obesity rates go exactly in the opposite direction. Obesity rates are lowest among non-Hispanic whites. Actually, obesity rates generally are quite high, because going from 31% to 34 to 43, there's a lot of obesity out there in the United States. So I'm not diminishing The problem of obesity, in fact, as you can see later, it has devastating behavioral consequences. And then another study we published quite some time ago dealt with reverse causality. We found that people who had been trying to lose weight were using low-calorie sweeteners, beverages, tabletop, and low-calorie sweeteners in food because they had been trying to lose weight over the previous year. So this is a way that we managed to attach motivations to enhance data. And again, we adjusted all the analysis for body mass index. So the drivers of choice for low-calorie sweeteners: age, gender, education, income, dietary choices, health status, and so on. And just one final point, people who were using low-calorie sweeteners generally had better diets. This is Healthy Eating Index 2005. It's a 100-point scale developed by the USDA to measure compliance with dietary guidelines for Americans. Dietary guidelines come out every 5 years. So does HEI. So there's been HEI 2010, HEI 2015. This is 2005 because we did this a while back. And I just want to show you that the components of the Healthy Eating Index, the most important one is SOFAs: solid fats, added sugars, and alcohol. The higher the points score, the less added sugar consumption. And notice here that consumers of any low-calorie sweetener or of beverages or foods have much better SOFA scores, which means they consume less added sugar. So any notion that the consumption of calorie sweeteners would lead you to consume more added sugar is completely false. We're finding the diets are generally better and the consumption of added sugar is less. Those, of course, are cross-sectional data, which means that these are associations. They do not in any way imply causality. It is not that better diets made people use low-calorie sweeteners or that low-calorie sweeteners allowed people to select a better diet. It's an association. Personally, I suspect that low-calorie sweeteners are in fact a marker, an index of a relatively healthy diet. So to summarize these population studies, in the US, consumers are older, richer, better educated, they have higher quality diets, and although users of low-calorie beverages were more likely to be overweight, they were using low-calorie sweeteners for the purpose of losing weight. And there was a strong socio-demographic component to the beverage behaviors. So I took this graph from one of the publications. These topics are going to be discussed later today. I was rather disappointed that the AHA publication mentioned many of these issues, but did not address any of these many papers, some of them by people in the room, that actually refuted the various hypotheses that were mentioned. And there's a great deal of work on oral consequences, cephalic phase insulin, hunger, and satiety, all of which published, which actually disproves many of those hypotheses, and some of the papers were published, I hate to tell you, as early or as long ago as 1992. But sometimes evidence and science have no impact on policy. We have to learn to live with that. So let me just finish with something different. In a Seattle obesity study, we now geocode all the dietary intake patterns. In other words, we know what you eat and we know where you live. Geocoding is a very, very powerful way of mapping behaviors, health status, and so on at any level of geographic resolution, depending on the quality of your data. So I just skipped this slide. And here in the Seattle obesity study, we actually had 2,000 adults living in Seattle, working in Seattle, and we've been following them for a while because the Seattle obesity study is now funded by the National Institutes of Health for the third go-around, which means that we have been lucky enough to be funded for the past 11 years. So we have a wealth of data on what people do, where they are, and what the health outcomes are. We have a surefire method to assess socioeconomic status. We don't ask people about income or education or any of those things. We go directly to the county tax assessor and we get the value of their home. It's in the public domain. It's flawless. And of course, notice here, this is a map of Seattle. The multi-million-dollar mansions on the waterfront are in dark green. Places by the freeway are in red. That has health consequences. Of course, it's to do with residential selection, purchasing power, buying power, and so on. So residential property values track SES. We have now looked at patterns of consumption of soda on the left, salad in the middle, and the HEI 2010 on the right. These are not the same people. They do not live in the same houses. They live in different places. Telling people to stop drinking soda and start eating salad is an economic issue, and some people are not able to do that. So here, interestingly, low-calorie sweeteners would be right there with this salad and the bottled water and the Perrier and so on in the middle. The graph on the left is drinkers of soda. This, of course, is Seattle, not Texas. So the soda consumption is in the order of 2 cans per week. So it's actually fairly low. The city of Seattle enacted a tax. I suspect they will not make as much money as they think they will because the soda consumption is not at a very high level. But notice that there's a very, very, very strong socioeconomic gradient. And of course, obesity follows the same socioeconomic gradient. This is now an unprecedented map of obesity rates in Seattle King County by census block. You may have seen maps of obesity by state in the United States, various things lighting up in different colors. Wipe them away from your mind. Don't even refer to them again. Look at detailed maps at a very, very small level of aggregation. Zip codes, census tracts, this is census block. There are very, very few finer things. And notice again, less obesity on the waterfront, more obesity by the freeway. Obesity really does follow a socioeconomic gradient. So now, I will allow myself a parting shot, because today, you may know, is midterm elections in the United States. So I'm going to show you, some of you have seen it before, a graph which I came up with back in November 2016. And this one shocked quite a few people. So prepare to be shocked or surprised, because here we looked at percent obese adults by state in 2014 and the election results in 2016. And the size of the bubble is the number of electoral votes in the Electoral College. And notice that with the exception of Washington, D.C., which is a little bubble in itself to the left, which some people said was the problem to begin with, California, New York, all the other states show this linear trend. Worse. A colleague of mine drew this map for the UK. Which means, as I was saying before, obesity and health are not the end. They are the beginning of all kinds of unexpected, controversial, and shocking things. And so the question I want to leave you with for today is whether Brexit could have been prevented by low-calorie sweeteners. Thank you.